Sometimes the most life-changing moments come disguised as ordinary Tuesday afternoons. Picture this: a weathered farmer standing in his dusty overalls at a small-town grocery store, reaching for the same brand of coffee he's bought for 15 years. Behind him, a woman's voice cuts through the mundane silence like lightning through a summer storm. 3 simple words that will shatter everything he thought he knew about love, second chances, and the courage to start over at 55. What happens when fate decides to rewrite your story in the most unexpected place? When someone sees past your calloused hands and tired eyes to glimpse the man you forgot you could be? This isn't just another love story, it's about the moment when ordinary people discover that extraordinary love can bloom in the most unlikely soil. Get ready to witness how 4 words spoken by a stranger in aisle 7 became the seed of the most beautiful transformation one man had ever experienced. Because sometimes, when life has beaten you down and you've forgotten how to dream, all it takes is someone brave enough to say, "I choose you." Thomas Mitchell had always been a creature of habit. Every Tuesday at exactly 3:30 in the afternoon, he would park his rusted pickup truck outside Miller's grocery store, walk through the automatic doors with his shoulders slightly hunched from decades of farm work, and follow the same route through the aisles. Milk, bread, coffee, and whatever vegetables looked decent enough to last him through the week. At 55, he had perfected the art of efficient solitude. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he made his way toward the coffee aisle, his worn work boots silent against the linoleum floor. Thomas had learned to move quietly through life, to take up as little space as possible. It was a skill he'd developed after his divorce 8 years earlier, when Sarah had packed her bags and told him that living with him was like being married to a ghost. She wasn't wrong. After 30 years of marriage, he had somehow forgotten how to be present, how to engage with the world around him. The farm demanded everything from him. Every morning before dawn, he was out checking on the cattle, mending fences, tending to crops that seemed to grow more challenging each season. The physical labor had kept him strong, but it had also become his escape from the complexities of human connection. Cows didn't ask how your day was. Corn didn't require emotional availability. The land accepted his dedication without question, and, in return, it gave him purpose, even if it couldn't give him companionship. Thomas reached for his usual brand of coffee, the same medium roast he'd been buying since he was 25. His movements were mechanical, practiced. He barely noticed the other shoppers around him, the way families moved through the store together, children chattering excitedly about breakfast cereals while their parents navigated the mundane logistics of feeding a household. He had trained himself not to see these things, not to feel the sharp edge of loneliness that came with witnessing other people's ordinary happiness. That's when he heard her voice. "Excuse me, but I have to ask about your hands." Thomas froze, his fingers still wrapped around the coffee container. He turned slowly, uncertain if the voice was actually directed at him. Standing 3 feet away was a woman about his age, maybe slightly younger, with silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans and a soft green sweater, and her eyes were the kind of warm brown that reminded him of rich soil after rain. But it was her expression that caught him off guard. There was no pity there, no judgment, just genuine curiosity and something else he couldn't quite identify. "I'm sorry," he managed to say, his voice rough from disuse. He realized he hadn't spoken to anyone except the cashiers and his few remaining neighbors in weeks. She smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "Your hands," she repeated, gesturing gently toward where he still gripped the coffee. "They tell such a story. I'm sorry if this sounds strange, but I'm an artist, and I notice things like that. You have the hands of someone who's spent his life creating something meaningful." Thomas looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. They were indeed telling, calloused and weathered, with permanent dirt lines etched into the creases despite his careful washing. One knuckle bore a scar from a barbed wire incident 2 summers ago, and his wedding ring finger still showed a pale band where his ring had lived for 3 decades before he'd finally taken it off. "I'm a farmer," he said simply, not sure what else to offer. "I thought so," she said, her smile widening. "There's something different about farmers' hands. They're not just tools, they're instruments of care. You can tell when someone has spent their life nurturing things, helping them grow." Thomas felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. When was the last time someone had noticed anything positive about him?
When was the last time anyone had really looked at him at all?
I'm Elena, she said, extending one of her own hands toward him.
Elena Martinez.
Thomas, he replied, hesitating only briefly before taking her hand in his. Her skin was soft but not delicate, and she didn't flinch at the roughness of his palm.
Thomas Mitchell. It's nice to meet you, Thomas Mitchell.
There was something in the way she said his name, as if she were tasting it, committing it to memory.
Do you mind if I ask what you grow?
For the next 20 minutes, Thomas found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, talking about his work with enthusiasm. He told Elena about his 150-acre spread, how he'd inherited it from his father and had been working it for over 3 decades. He described the satisfaction of watching cornstalks reach toward the sun, the complex relationship between weather and timing, the way cattle became almost like extended family members with their own personalities and quirks. Elena listened with an attention that felt almost foreign to him. She asked questions that showed she was actually hearing what he was saying, not just waiting for her turn to speak. When he mentioned the challenges of running a farm alone, she didn't offer empty sympathy or rushed solutions. Instead, she nodded with understanding, as if she knew something about carrying heavy loads by yourself. I moved here 6 months ago, she told him when he finally asked about her story.
I'm a painter, mostly landscapes and portraits.
I was living in Chicago for 25 years, married to a man who thought art was a nice hobby for when I finished my real responsibilities. Her voice carried the weight of old pain, but also the lightness of someone who had made peace with difficult decisions. After our daughter graduated college, I realized I had spent so many years being who everyone else needed me to be that I had no idea who I actually was.
Thomas understood this feeling more deeply than he could express. So you left?
I left, she confirmed. Bought a little house on Maple Street, turned the spare bedroom into a studio, and decided to find out what Elena Martinez actually wants from life. They stood there in the coffee aisle, 2 people who had somehow found themselves in conversation when they had both grown accustomed to silence. Other shoppers moved around them, but Thomas felt as if they were in their own small bubble of connection. I know this might sound forward, Elena said, and Thomas noticed a slight flush in her cheeks, but would you be interested in modeling for me sometime? Not in a formal way, she added quickly, seeing his expression. Just, your hands, maybe while you're working. I've been trying to capture the dignity of honest work in my paintings, and I think you might help me understand it better. Thomas felt his automatic refusal forming on his lips, the polite decline, the retreat back into his comfortable isolation. But something about Elena's direct gaze, the genuine interest in her voice, made him pause.
When was the last time anyone had asked him for anything that wasn't a bill payment or a favor that benefited them more than him?
I don't know much about art, he said finally.
That's okay, Elena replied. I don't know much about farming. Maybe we could teach each other.
There was something in her voice, a hopefulness, an openness, that reminded Thomas of spring mornings when the world felt full of possibility. It scared him a little, this feeling of doors opening when he had grown so comfortable with them being closed.
I suppose.
He began, then stopped, shaking his head.
No, I'm sorry. I'm not really the type for that kind of thing.
Elena studied his face for a moment, and Thomas had the unsettling feeling that she could see more than he was comfortable showing. But, instead of pushing, she simply nodded.
I understand, she said gently. But, if you change your mind, I'm in the phone book. Elena Martinez on Maple Street.
She paused, then added, sometimes the most interesting art comes from unexpected places. She gave him one more smile, the kind that seemed to carry warmth long after she turned away. Thomas watched her walk down the aisle, her movements confident but not hurried. She stopped to examine some apples with the same attention she had given his words, and he found himself wondering what it would be like to see the world through her eyes, to find beauty and interest in ordinary things. That night, Thomas sat on his front porch with a cup of the coffee he'd finally remembered to buy, looking out over his fields as the sun set behind the distant tree line. The evening routine was the same as always: check the weather forecast, review tomorrow's tasks, listen to the sounds of his land settling into darkness.
But something felt different.
Elena's words kept echoing in his mind, particularly her observation about his hands being instruments of care.
He looked down at those hands wrapped around his coffee mug. For so long, he had seen them only as tools, means to an end. But Elena had seen something else, a story, a purpose, even a kind of beauty. It was a strange feeling, being seen that way. Unsettling but not unpleasant. The phone rang from inside the house, interrupting his thoughts. It was probably his sister checking in from 2 states away, or maybe the feed store calling about his order. Thomas considered letting it go to the machine. He had grown comfortable with minimal interruptions to his evening solitude. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he got up to answer it. Hello? Thomas? It's Elena.
From the grocery store today.
His grip tightened on the phone. Elena. Hi. I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from directory assistance.
I wanted to apologize if I made you uncomfortable earlier.
I have a tendency to be too direct sometimes.
No, Thomas said, surprised by his own certainty.
No, you didn't make me uncomfortable. At least, not in a bad way. There was a pause, and he could hear her soft laugh. Good. I was wondering if you might be willing to show me your farm sometime. Not for the painting necessarily, just. I'd like to understand what you do. If that's not too forward.
Thomas looked out his kitchen window toward the fields that had been his whole world for so many years. The idea of sharing this space with someone else, someone who might see it with fresh eyes, sent a flutter of nervousness through his chest. But underneath the nervousness was something else, anticipation. When were you thinking? He heard himself ask.
How about Saturday morning? I could bring coffee and we could watch the sunrise.
Thomas Mitchell, who had spent 8 years perfecting the art of polite refusal, who had built his life around predictable routines and comfortable isolation, found himself saying yes. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that only October could deliver. Thomas had been awake since 4:30, not because he needed to be, but because sleep had become elusive the moment he'd agreed to Elena's visit. He found himself moving through his morning routine with unusual attention to detail, showering longer than necessary, putting on his newer pair of work jeans instead of the ones with paint stains, even running a comb through his graying hair twice. By the time Elena's small blue sedan pulled into his gravel driveway at 6:15, Thomas had already fed the cattle, checked the fence line, and reorganized his tool shed. Nervous energy had transformed into productivity, though he wasn't entirely sure why he felt nervous at all. It wasn't as if he'd never had visitors to the farm. His sister had come by occasionally over the years, and there had been the odd neighbor stopping by to borrow equipment or discuss shared property lines. But this felt different. This felt like an invitation into his world, rather than an obligation or convenience. Elena stepped out of her car carrying a thermos and what appeared to be a small sketch pad. She wore jeans and boots that looked practical rather than fashionable, and a canvas jacket that had clearly seen some use. Her hair was loose today, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, and Thomas noticed how the morning light seemed to catch the silver threads that ran through the brown. "Good morning," she called out, her breath visible in small puffs in the cool air. "I brought coffee like I promised, and I hope you don't mind, but I also brought some of yesterday's banana bread. I tend to bake when I'm nervous." The admission surprised him. "You're nervous?" Elena laughed, a sound that seemed to scatter some of his own tension. "Terrified, actually. What if I say something ignorant about farming? What if I accidentally offend one of your cows? What if I trip and fall face first into a mud puddle?" "The cows are pretty forgiving," Thomas said, finding himself almost smiling. "And most of the mud puddles are clearly marked." "Most of them? I'll warn you about the tricky ones." They walked toward the main barn, Elena's eyes moving constantly as she took in the details of his operation. Thomas found himself seeing his farm through her perspective, the way the morning light hit the weathered wood of the barn, the geometric patterns created by the fence lines, the way his cattle moved together across the pasture like a slow, living puzzle. "How long have you been doing this?" Elena asked as Thomas opened the barn doors. "All my life, really. My father started this farm in 1952, built most of these structures himself." I grew up here, left for college thinking I'd become an engineer or something practical like that, but ended up coming back after 2 years. Thomas ran his hand along the barn door frame, feeling the smooth wood that his father's hands had shaped.
Funny how the land calls you back.
It's not funny, Elena said softly. It's beautiful. There's something profound about continuing something your father started, about being connected to the same piece of earth for generations. Thomas had never thought of it in quite those terms. To him, it had always been simply what he did, what was expected, what made sense. But Elena's words made him consider the deeper currents of his choice, the way his feet had learned every uneven spot in these fields, the way he could read weather patterns in the behavior of his animals, the way the rhythm of seasons had become the rhythm of his life.
They spent the next hour walking the property.
Thomas showed her the vegetable garden where he grew tomatoes and corn for his own table, the old apple orchard his grandfather had planted, the creek that ran along the eastern border of his land.
Elena asked questions that revealed her genuine curiosity, about crop rotation, about the relationship between farmers and weather, about the economics of small-scale agriculture in an increasingly corporate world.
It's not easy, Thomas admitted as they stood looking out over his cornfield, the stalks now brown and ready for harvest.
Every year it gets harder to compete with the big operations. The margins get thinner, the regulations more complex. Some days I wonder if I'm just being stubborn, holding on to something that doesn't make sense anymore.
But you keep doing it, Elena observed.
I keep doing it. Why?
Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering the question he had asked himself countless times, especially during the difficult years after his divorce when the loneliness felt like another weight he had to carry alongside all his other responsibilities. I think, he said finally, because this land and I understand each other.
It doesn't ask me to be anything other than what I am.
It doesn't need me to be charming or articulate or socially adept. It just needs me to pay attention, to show up every day, to care for it consistently. And, in return, it gives me something to do with all that caring. Elena turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful.
That's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said about work. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks.
I'm not usually much good with words.
You're better than you think.
She opened her sketch pad and began drawing, her hand moving quickly across the paper.
Would you mind standing where you were? Just like that, looking out over the field?
For the next 20 minutes, Elena sketched while Thomas stood awkwardly, unsure where to look or how to position himself. But, gradually, as Elena worked in concentrated silence, he began to relax. The awkwardness faded as he found himself genuinely looking at his land, seeing it rather than simply moving through it as he did during his daily routines. You love this place, Elena said without looking up from her sketch pad.
I suppose I do. It shows. In the way you walk across it, the way you touch things as you pass them. The way you talk about it.
She glanced up at him briefly.
Love always shows, even when people don't realize they're revealing it. Thomas thought about this as Elena continued sketching.
Love had become such a complicated concept for him over the past 8 years. His marriage had ended not in dramatic confrontation but in gradual erosion, two people who had somehow forgotten how to see each other clearly. Sarah had accused him of loving the farm more than her, and he had been unable to argue convincingly that this wasn't true. Not because he had loved the farm more, but because he had never learned to express his love for her in ways she could recognize.
Can I ask you something personal?
Elena said, still focused on her drawing.
Okay. When you're working out here alone, do you ever feel lonely?
The question hit him more directly than he had expected.
Yes, he said simply. But I've gotten used to it. That's not the same as it being okay.
No, Thomas agreed.
It's not the same.
Elena finished her sketch and showed it to him. Somehow, with just pencil lines on paper, she had captured not just his physical form but something essential about the moment, the way he stood rooted to his land, the sense of belonging and responsibility in his posture, even a hint of the loneliness he carried.
This is how I see you, she said quietly. This is what I saw in the grocery store that made me speak to you.
Thomas stared at the sketch, seeing himself through someone else's eyes for the first time in years. The man in Elena's drawing wasn't defeated or diminished by solitude. He was substantial, grounded, dignified in his quiet strength. "I don't know if I see myself that way," he said. "Maybe that's the problem." They walked back toward the house as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and warming the air. Elena had accepted his invitation for breakfast, and Thomas found himself in the unfamiliar position of preparing food for someone else. His kitchen was functional but spare, a reflection of his bachelor lifestyle and his tendency to view meals as fuel rather than social occasions. "Let me help," Elena offered, but Thomas found himself wanting to do this one thing properly, to show that he was capable of hospitality even if he was out of practice. He made scrambled eggs with cheese, bacon that he didn't burn, and toast that came out golden rather than charred. Elena contributed her banana bread and coffee that was significantly better than his usual morning brew. They sat at his kitchen table, a sturdy oak piece his father had built, and Thomas realized this was the first time in over a year that this table had been used for its intended purpose rather than as a place to sort mail and review agricultural reports. "Tell me about your painting," Thomas said, surprising himself with the question. He had spent so many years focused inward that asking about other people's lives felt like using muscles that had grown weak from disuse. Elena's face lit up in a way that made Thomas understand why artists were drawn to capturing light. "I've been painting since I was 12, but for most of my adult life it was something I did in stolen moments between everything else. My husband thought it was a nice hobby, something to keep me busy while he focused on his career, and we raised our daughter." "What changed?" "I did. Or maybe I just finally admitted what had been true for a long time." Elena wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, staring into it as if reading tea leaves. "One morning I woke up and realized that I had spent 30 years supporting everyone else's dreams and had no idea what my own dreams even looked like anymore. My daughter was grown and happy, my husband was successful and content, and I felt like I was disappearing." Thomas understood this feeling intimately. After Sarah left, he had gone through a similar reckoning, the realization that he had become so focused on maintaining the farm, on meeting obligations and responsibilities, that he had forgotten who he was beneath all those roles. "So you started over?" "I started over. Bought this little house, set up my studio, and began painting like I meant it. Really painting, not just dabbling." Elena's eyes met his across the table. "It's the scariest thing I've ever done, but also the most alive I've felt in decades." They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing in a way that felt natural despite Thomas's usual discomfort with extended social interaction. Elena told him about her daughter, who was teaching English in South Korea and sending home photographs of Seoul street food and ancient temples. Thomas shared stories about his father, who had died 5 years earlier, and the way the farm still carried echoes of his presence. "I should probably let you get back to your day," Elena said eventually, though she made no move to leave. "I'm sure you have work to do." Thomas did have work to do, there was always work to do on a farm. But, for the first time in years, the work didn't feel urgent. It could wait another hour, another afternoon even. Actually, he heard himself saying, "I was planning to start bringing in the corn today. If you're interested in seeing how that works." Elena's smile was immediate and genuine. "I would love that." They spent the rest of the day together. Elena watched as Thomas operated the combine harvester, her sketchpad never far from reach as she captured the mechanics of harvest, the way grain flowed like golden water into the storage bins, the satisfaction on Thomas's face as he worked. She helped where she could, though she admitted she was better at observing than participating in agricultural tasks. But it wasn't really about the corn or the machinery or even the art. It was about the gradual recognition that they were both people who had learned to find meaning in solitude but had perhaps forgotten that meaning could be even richer when shared. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades that Elena kept pointing out and naming, "Look at that cadmium orange, and the way it transitions to quinacridone violet," Thomas realized that this had been the best day he'd experienced in years. "Thank you," Elena said as they stood watching the sunset from his front porch, her sketchpad now full of drawings from their day together. "For what?" "For letting me see your world. For trusting me with something you clearly love so much." She paused, then added more quietly, "For reminding me that there are still genuine people in the world."
Thomas felt something shifting inside his chest, some locked door beginning to creak open. "Thank you for seeing it," he said. "For seeing me." Elena turned to face him fully, and, in the fading light, Thomas could see something in her expression that made his heart race in a way it hadn't in years. There was warmth there, and interest, and something that looked almost like affection. "Thomas," she said softly, "I hope this isn't presumptuous, but would you like to have dinner with me sometime? Not here, not at my place, but somewhere neutral. Somewhere we can just talk?" The old Thomas, the Thomas who had perfected the art of polite refusal, began to form his automatic decline. But that Thomas felt like a stranger now, someone from a different life. This Thomas, the one who had spent the day seeing his world through Elena's eyes, found himself nodding. "I'd like that very much." As Elena drove away, her taillights disappearing around the bend in his long driveway, Thomas remained on his porch long after the sound of her car had faded. The familiar evening sounds of his farm surrounded him, cattle settling for the night, the whisper of wind through the corn stubble, the distant call of an owl beginning its hunt. But, tonight, these sounds felt different. They felt like the beginning of something rather than just another day's end. Inside his house, Thomas picked up the phone and dialed his sister's number. When she answered, he could hear the surprise in her voice. He never called in the evening, never initiated conversations that weren't about practical matters. "Thomas? Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," he said, and realized it was true in a way it hadn't been for years. "Actually, everything's more than fine. I wanted to tell you about someone I met." Their first dinner date took place on a Thursday evening at Mason's, a small restaurant 20 miles from Thomas's farm that specialized in homestyle cooking and had been serving the farming community for over 40 years. Thomas had suggested it partly because the food was good and honest, but mostly because he knew the environment would be comfortable, filled with people who understood the rhythm of agricultural life and wouldn't stare at his work-weathered hands or his careful way of speaking. Elena arrived wearing a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and Thomas had made an effort he hadn't made in years: khaki pants instead of jeans, a button-down shirt that Sarah had given him for Christmas years ago and that still carried the faint scent of the cedar chest where it had been stored. They sat across from each other at a corner table, and Thomas was struck by how natural it felt despite his nervousness. "I have a confession," Elena said after they had ordered. "I've been thinking about our day at your farm nonstop. Not just because of the art, though the sketches turned out better than I hoped. But because of how present you were. How completely yourself." Thomas felt that familiar flush of embarrassment. "I don't know about that." "I do. There's something remarkable about watching someone do what they're truly meant to do. You move through that land like you're in conversation with it. It's beautiful to witness." Over dinner, their conversation ranged from practical matters, Elena's adjustment to small-town life, Thomas's concerns about the upcoming winter, to deeper territory. Elena talked about the loneliness of reinventing herself in middle age, the way her marriage had slowly become more about parallel lives than shared ones. Thomas found himself opening up about his divorce, about the ways he had failed as a husband, not through dramatic betrayal but through gradual emotional withdrawal. "Sarah used to say I was married to the farm first and her second," Thomas said, pushing green beans around his plate. "I always argued with that, but, looking back, I think she was right. Not because I loved the land more, but because I knew how to love the land. I knew what it needed from me, when to tend it and when to leave it alone. With Sarah, I never figured that out." "Love is different with different people," Elena said gently. "What Sarah needed might not be what everyone needs." There was something in her tone that made Thomas look up from his plate. Elena was watching him with that same attention she had given his hands in the grocery store, as if she were seeing something he wasn't aware he was revealing. "What do you need?" he asked, surprising himself with the directness of the question. Elena was quiet for a moment, considering. "Honesty. Presence. Someone who isn't trying to change me or be changed by me, but who wants to grow alongside me." She paused, then added with a small smile, "And someone who won't think I'm crazy for getting up at 5 in the morning to paint the sunrise." "I'm up at 5 every morning anyway," Thomas said, and they both laughed. Their friendship developed over the following weeks with the steady progression of seasons.
Elena began visiting the farm regularly, sometimes to paint, sometimes simply to talk while Thomas worked. She brought coffee and homemade bread, and gradually began contributing to farm tasks in small ways, helping sort apples from his orchard, keeping him company during evening cattle checks, even learning to drive his old pickup truck around the property. Thomas, meanwhile, found himself making changes he hadn't expected. He cleaned out the spare bedroom that had become a repository for old farming magazines and broken equipment, thinking Elena might like to use it as a studio when the weather was too harsh for outdoor painting. He started cooking real meals again, remembering how much he had once enjoyed the process of creating something nurturing with his hands. He even bought new sheets for his bed, though he told himself it was simply time to replace the worn ones. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Thomas's sister noticed it during her Thanksgiving visit, commenting that he seemed lighter somehow, more engaged with the world around him. His neighbors began remarking on changes too, how he lingered to chat when he picked up feed at the agricultural supply store, how he had started attending the monthly Grange meetings he had skipped for years. But the most profound changes were the ones only Thomas could feel. He was remembering what it felt like to anticipate someone's company, to plan his day around the possibility of shared experiences. He caught himself humming while he worked, choosing tasks that would keep him near the house when he expected Elena to visit. He started seeing his farm through her eyes, noticing the way morning light transformed familiar landscapes, appreciating the artistry and the patterns his cattle created as they moved across pastures. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of blizzard that could isolate rural properties for days. Thomas had weathered dozens of such storms alone, using the enforced solitude to catch up on equipment maintenance and planning for the following year's crops. But this time, when the snow began falling on a Saturday afternoon in December, his first thought was of Elena, alone in her small house in town. He called her as the storm intensified. "How are you set for supplies?" "I have plenty of food and the power's still on, so I should be fine." There was a pause. "How are you doing out there?" "Good. The cattle are secure and I've got everything I need." Thomas looked out his kitchen window at the snow that was already several inches deep and falling harder. "But I was thinking, if you wanted some company during this storm, you'd be welcome to stay here. The house is warmer than what you're probably used to, and I have a generator if the power goes out." Another pause, longer this time. "Thomas, are you asking me to weather a blizzard with you?" "I guess I am." "I'll pack a bag." Elena arrived an hour later, her small car barely making it up Thomas's driveway through the accumulating snow. She carried an overnight bag and a canvas tote filled with art supplies, her cheeks red from the cold and her eyes bright with something that looked like excitement. "I've never ridden out a storm on a working farm," she said as Thomas helped her inside. "This feels like an adventure." They spent that evening cooking dinner together, a pot roast that filled the kitchen with warmth and the kind of rich aromas that make a house feel like a home. Elena sketched while Thomas prepared vegetables, capturing his hands as they moved with practiced efficiency, the concentration on his face as he seasoned the meat. They talked about their childhoods, their dreams, the books they had read and the places they hoped to travel. As night fell and the storm intensified, they settled in Thomas's living room with glasses of wine and the comfortable silence of people who had learned to be at ease with each other. Elena had brought a book of poetry, and Thomas found himself listening as she read aloud, her voice giving life to words he would never have chosen for himself but that somehow seemed to capture feelings he had never learned to articulate. "Listen to this," Elena said, finding a particular poem. "It's by Mary Oliver. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last, and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" Thomas considered the question in the context of his own existence. For so many years, his answer would have been simple: take care of the farm, meet his responsibilities, endure whatever came with quiet dignity. But, sitting in his warm living room with Elena beside him, snow piling against the windows and the future feeling suddenly full of possibility, he realized his answer was changing. "What would you do," he asked, "with your one wild and precious life?" Elena closed the book and looked directly at him. "I think I'd choose to spend it with someone who understands that love isn't about changing each other, but about creating space for each other to grow.
Someone who sees the beauty in ordinary moments and isn't afraid of the depth that comes with real intimacy.
Thomas felt his heart begin to race.
Elena.
I know this might be moving too fast, she said quietly. I know we've only known each other a few months.
But, Thomas, I need you to know something.
She reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his.
I choose you. Not because you're safe or convenient or because I'm lonely.
I choose you because you're genuine and kind, and because when I'm with you, I remember who I am at my best. The words hit Thomas like revelation.
I choose you.
Not I love you or I need you or any of the complicated declarations that had characterized his marriage. Simply, clearly, I choose you. I don't know how to do this, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. It's been so long since I tried to build something with another person.
We'll figure it out together.
Elena's thumb moved across his knuckles, tracing the familiar scars and calluses.
We don't have to have all the answers tonight.
They didn't make love that night, though the possibility hung in the air between them like the charged atmosphere before summer lightning. Instead, they held each other on Thomas's couch, talking until the early hours of morning about their fears and hopes, their past mistakes and future dreams. Elena fell asleep with her head on Thomas's shoulder, and he spent the remaining hours until dawn simply holding her, marveling at the way her presence transformed his familiar space into something entirely new. The storm continued for 2 more days, and those 48 hours became a cocoon of intimacy that neither Thomas nor Elena had expected. They cooked meals together, with Elena learning Thomas's practical approach to food while he discovered her more adventurous palate. They worked side by side, Elena helping with simplified farm chores while Thomas posed for sketches that captured not just his physical form but the growing happiness in his expression. On the second evening, as they sat by the fire Thomas had built in his living room fireplace, Elena looked around the room with the eye of someone considering permanent changes.
This house has good bones, she said. But it could use some color. Some life. What did you have in mind?
Well, that wall would be perfect for paintings. And the kitchen could use some curtains, maybe some plants on the windowsill. Elena paused, then looked directly at him.
If you were interested in making some changes, that is. Thomas understood she wasn't really talking about interior decoration. What kind of changes? The kind where I don't have to drive home every evening.
Where we wake up together and plan our days around each other's rhythms. Where your farm becomes our farm, and my art becomes part of the life we build together.
Thomas had never made a major life decision quickly.
Every choice, from crop rotations to equipment purchases to the eventual decision to divorce Sarah, had been considered carefully, weighed against practical concerns and long-term consequences. But, looking at Elena in the firelight, seeing the hope and vulnerability in her expression, he realized that some decisions were meant to be made with the heart rather than the head. I'd like that very much, he said simply. Elena's smile was radiant.
Really? Really? Though I should warn you, farm life isn't easy.
The hours are long, the work is hard, and there's always something that needs fixing or attention. Thomas, Elena said, moving closer to him on the couch, I'm 52 years old and I've spent the last year learning to live alone. I'm not afraid of hard work or long hours. What I'm afraid of is wasting whatever time we have left being cautious when we could be brave. That night, they did make love, with the tenderness of people who had found each other after long periods of solitude. Thomas had forgotten how profound physical intimacy could be when it was grounded in genuine affection and mutual respect. Elena's body told its own stories, stretch marks from pregnancy, scars from childhood accidents, the softness that came with middle age, and Thomas found each detail beautiful in its honesty. Afterward, lying together in Thomas's bed with snow still falling outside, Elena traced patterns on his chest with her fingertip. I have something to confess, she said.
That day in the grocery store? I had noticed you before.
You'd been shopping there the same day and time for weeks, and I had been working up the courage to speak to you.
Thomas turned to look at her. Really?
Really? There was something about the way you moved through the store, so careful and self-contained.
And your hands, obviously. But mostly it was your eyes.
You looked like someone who had stories to tell but no one to tell them to.
What made you finally speak to me that day? Elena was quiet for a moment, considering. I realized I had a choice. I could keep being the kind of person who noticed things but didn't act on them, or I could be the kind of person who took chances on beautiful possibilities. She looked up at him. I chose to take the chance. I'm glad you did. So am I.
6 months later, Elena officially moved into Thomas's farmhouse, bringing with her paintings that transformed the plain walls into celebrations of light and color, books that filled empty shelves, and the kind of feminine touches that made the space feel like a home rather than just a place where someone lived. She converted the spare bedroom into her studio, positioning her easel where she could look out over the fields that had become as familiar to her as they were to Thomas. Their life together developed its own rhythm, different from either of their previous existences but somehow perfectly suited to who they were becoming together. Elena learned the seasonal cycles of farm work, adjusting her painting schedule to accommodate busy periods like planting and harvest. Thomas learned to see his land through Elena's artist's eyes, developing an appreciation for the aesthetic beauty that had always surrounded him but that he had been too focused on practicalities to notice. They hosted Elena's daughter when she returned from Korea for Christmas, and Thomas was touched by how naturally the young woman accepted him as part of her mother's life. They began attending community events together, church suppers, grange meetings, local art shows where Elena's farm-inspired paintings drew admiring attention from neighbors who had never thought of agriculture as artistic subject matter. But perhaps the most significant change was simply the return of joy to Thomas's daily existence. Work that had once felt like obligation now felt like collaboration, with Elena often joining him for morning chores or evening walks through the pastures. Meals became occasions for conversation rather than fuel stops. Evenings brought shared reading, Elena's painting, and the simple pleasure of companionship. You know what I love most about our life? Elena said one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades she was already planning to capture in her next painting. What's that? We chose each other as we are, not as who we might become. You didn't try to turn me into a farm wife, and I didn't try to turn you into some romanticized version of a farmer. We just fit. Thomas considered this, understanding the truth of it. So much of his marriage to Sarah had been about trying to meet expectations, trying to be the husband she needed him to be while silently resenting that it felt like an impossible performance. With Elena, he could simply be Thomas Mitchell, farmer, a man who loved his land and was learning to love again in ways he had thought were beyond him. I choose you too, he said, echoing the words that had started their journey toward each other. Every day, I choose you. Elena reached over and took his hand, her fingers tracing the familiar landscape of calluses and scars that had first caught her attention in a grocery store aisle. Every day, she agreed. For whatever time we have left, I choose you. As the sun set over Thomas Mitchell's farm, painting the fields gold and casting long shadows across the land he had worked for 30 years, he realized that his life had become something he could never have imagined during those long years of solitude. Not because it was dramatic or extraordinary, but because it was exactly what it was supposed to be, a life chosen consciously, lived with intention, and shared with someone who saw the beauty in ordinary things. The cows settled for the night, the evening air filled with the familiar sounds of his farm finding its rhythm. But now those sounds felt like music, like the soundtrack to a life that had finally found its proper melody. Tomorrow would bring the usual work, fields to tend, animals to care for, the endless cycle of tasks that define agricultural life. But it would also bring Elena's laughter over morning coffee, her presence beside him as he moved through his day, and the quiet joy of knowing that someone had chosen him not in spite of who he was, but because of it. In the fading light, Thomas Mitchell understood something that had eluded him for most of his 56 years. Love wasn't about finding someone who completed you or changed you into someone better. Love was about finding someone who saw you clearly and chose to build a life alongside your authentic self. Love was about the courage to say, and mean, and live by 4 simple words: I choose you.